I can absolutely do that, but I can't provide the full text you requested in a single response because it's far beyond the maximum length I can generate at once. Instead, I'll write it as a serialized story, stopping at a natural turning point. When you reply continue, I'll seamlessly continue from exactly where it ended, maintaining the same characters, timeline, tone, and plot. Part 1. Adrian Mercer had always believed that betrayal announced itself with raised voices, broken promises, or at least a warning hidden inside someone's eyes, but the morning everything collapsed looked painfully ordinary, beginning with sunlight spilling through the kitchen windows of his lakeside cabin while coffee steamed from a chipped blue mug and birds scattered across the mist above the water. His phone buzzed with a message from his younger brother Ethan asking if he was still coming to the family meeting, followed seconds later by another message from Lucas, Ethan's identical twin, reminding him not to be late because they had something important to celebrate. Adrian smiled despite himself. The brothers had spent years rebuilding their relationship after a difficult childhood, and although they often competed with each other, lately they had seemed united. Their late father's construction company had finally recovered after years of debt, and today they were supposed to sign the documents that would officially make all three equal partners. Adrian showered, dressed, locked the cabin, and drove toward the city without noticing the black SUV that quietly merged behind him several miles down the highway. The headquarters of Mercer Development occupied the corner of a busy downtown block where cranes stretched into the skyline like enormous steel skeletons. Employees greeted Adrian warmly as he entered the polished lobby, but he noticed subtle differences almost immediately. Conversations ended when he approached. Receptionists avoided eye contact. A security guard who had worked there for 10 years hesitated before allowing him through the gate. Upstairs in the executive conference room, Ethan and Lucas were already seated across from a sharply dressed attorney Adrian had never met. "You're late," Lucas said with a grin that looked almost identical to the one Adrian remembered from childhood, though something about it felt carefully rehearsed. "Traffic," Adrian answered, taking his seat. "So what's this celebration?" Ethan slid a thick folder across the polished table. "Just read it." Adrian opened the folder, expecting partnership agreements. Instead he found financial statements bearing his electronic signature authorizing millions of dollars transferred into offshore accounts. There were forged emails, contracts with non-existent companies, and evidence that someone inside Mercer Development had systematically stolen from clients for over 2 years. "What is this?" Adrian asked quietly. The attorney folded his hands. "These documents have already been submitted to federal investigators." Adrian laughed once, unable to process the absurdity. "Someone forged all this." Lucas sighed dramatically. "We wanted to believe that too." Adrian looked from one twin to the other, waiting for one of them to crack a smile and admit the joke had gone too far. Neither did. Ethan avoided his eyes. Lucas maintained perfect composure. Security officers entered the room. Adrian slowly stood. "You're serious?" "We had no choice," Ethan whispered. "Evidence is evidence." "Evidence that someone manufactured," Adrian snapped. "You know I didn't do this." Lucas leaned forward. "You always thought Dad trusted you most." "Maybe he did. But companies don't survive on favoritism." Adrian stared at him. "What does that mean?" Lucas's expression remained calm. "It means your resignation has already been accepted." One of the officers stepped closer. "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us." Adrian realized then that every step of this meeting had been planned long before he arrived. He didn't resist. Outside the building television crews were already waiting. Reporters shouted accusations before he reached the police vehicle. Cameras flashed relentlessly while headlines spread across phones around the city, presenting him as the executive responsible for one of the largest financial frauds in recent local history. By sunset his bank accounts had been frozen, his home searched, and every news station displayed his photograph beside the word fraud. After 2 nights in custody, Adrian was released pending investigation because prosecutors needed additional forensic analysis, but his reputation had already been destroyed. Friends stopped answering calls. Investors vanished. His cabin had been vandalized with red paint reading "thief" across the front wall. Standing in the wreckage, Adrian felt less angry than bewildered. Ethan had cried at their mother's funeral only 3 years earlier while promising the brothers would never abandon one another again. Lucas had toasted to family at every holiday dinner. Neither memory matched what had happened. Several days later, Adrian received an anonymous envelope slipped beneath the damaged cabin door. Inside was a single flash drive and a handwritten note: "They betrayed the wrong brother. Trust no one wearing your family name." The drive contained only 37 seconds of security footage from Mercer Development's underground parking garage recorded 3 weeks earlier. Adrian watched it repeatedly. The timestamp showed nearly midnight. Lucas walked toward a waiting sedan carrying a briefcase. Seconds later, another identical figure appeared from behind a concrete pillar. Ethan. The twins exchanged briefcases before driving away separately. Adrian frowned. Why switch identical cases in an empty parking garage? He enlarged the footage until the image became grainy. As Lucas turned, a silver key attached to one briefcase reflected the security light. The other case had no key. Someone wanted whatever was inside hidden even from surveillance. Before Adrian could examine the file further, his laptop suddenly shut down. Every screen turned black. Then a message appeared in white letters. "Stop digging. You have 24 hours. The power throughout the cabin abruptly failed." Outside, tires crunched across gravel. Adrian moved silently toward the window and barely lifted the curtain. 3 men stepped from an unfamiliar SUV. None wore uniforms. One carried a crowbar. Another held what looked unmistakably like a suppressed handgun. Adrian's pulse accelerated, but panic quickly gave way to calculation. The cabin had only one front entrance, but years earlier he had built a narrow emergency crawlspace beneath the back deck after a storm damaged the foundation. While the men forced the front door open, Adrian grabbed the flash drive, a flashlight, and his father's old compass before slipping through the hidden hatch into damp earth beneath the cabin. Wood splintered overhead as boots thundered across the floor. "Search everything," one man barked. "Find the drive." Adrian crawled through mud until he reached the woods behind the property. Rain began falling as darkness settled across the forest, swallowing every familiar landmark. Behind him, flashlights danced between the trees while voices spread outward in different directions. He resisted the urge to run. Instead, he slowed his breathing and listened carefully. One searcher moved recklessly, snapping branches. Another swept the flashlight in predictable arcs. The third remained silent, advancing with deliberate patience. Adrian changed direction twice before reaching the rocky edge of the lake where an abandoned fishing dock stretched into black water. He climbed beneath the weathered planks just as footsteps approached above him. "He can't have gone far," someone muttered. The beam of a flashlight passed inches from Adrian's face through narrow gaps between the boards. A phone rang overhead. "Boss says forget him," the man answered. "Burn the place." Adrian waited until the footsteps faded before emerging. Across the lake, orange flames suddenly erupted where his cabin stood. Heat shimmered against the rain while smoke curled into the night sky. Everything he owned disappeared within minutes, leaving only burning timber reflected across the water. Adrian tightened his grip on the flash drive. Whoever had framed him now wanted every trace of evidence erased, and if they were willing to set fire to his home, they would almost certainly kill him next. As emergency sirens echoed faintly in the distance, he turned away from the flames and disappeared deeper into the forest, unaware that the anonymous sender of the flash drive was already watching him from a ridge above, lowering a pair of binoculars and quietly saying to herself, "Good. He survived the first move." Adrian walked until dawn blurred the black horizon into a dull gray ribbon, every muscle aching from climbing through wet undergrowth while cold rain soaked his clothes and turned narrow animal trails into slippery channels of mud. He had no clear destination because every familiar place had become dangerous. Returning to the city meant cameras, police alerts, and the possibility that whoever had orchestrated the attack already controlled more people than he could imagine. Remaining in the wilderness offered temporary safety but no answers. He finally reached an abandoned service road where an old pickup truck rattled toward him carrying an elderly farmer transporting crates of vegetables to a nearby market. Adrian stepped into view with his hands raised, expecting suspicion, yet the old man simply rolled down the window and studied him for several long seconds before saying, "You look like you've been chased by either wolves or lawyers." "The wolves are easier to deal with." Adrian almost laughed despite everything. "Can you take me as far as the next town?" The farmer nodded without asking another question. During the drive, Adrian watched morning news playing on the truck's cracked dashboard screen. His own face filled the broadcast while a reporter confidently announced that investigators believed the disgraced businessman had fled after destroying evidence in an apparent accidental fire at his lakeside residence. Adrian stared at the screen in disbelief. The cabin had burned less than 6 hours earlier, yet the media already possessed a polished narrative explaining everything. Someone was directing events faster than the authorities could verify them. When they reached the small town of Millhaven, Adrian thanked the farmer and disappeared into the busy Saturday market where tourists mixed with locals. He bought a cheap baseball cap, a second-hand jacket, and a prepaid phone using the little cash still hidden inside his wallet. The first thing he did was insert the anonymous flash drive into a public computer at the town library. This time, instead of opening the visible video file, he examined the storage itself. Hidden beneath the security footage, he discovered an encrypted partition. Someone had intentionally concealed additional data. Unfortunately, every attempt to access it required a password. Adrian searched for clues inside the visible files but found nothing except one strange detail he had overlooked earlier. The timestamp embedded in the parking garage video had been altered. By comparing security camera frame rates, he realized the footage had actually been recorded nearly 6 months before the supposed financial crimes even began. Whoever sent it wanted him to notice that the briefcase exchange was connected to something much older than the investigation against him. A librarian approached quietly. "Sir, someone's been asking if you've used our computers today." Adrian's stomach tightened. "Who?" "2 men. Dark suits." They showed photographs. Adrian thanked her and immediately unplugged the drive. Instead of leaving through the front entrance, he exited through a rear emergency door leading into an alley. He had taken only a dozen steps when a black sedan rolled slowly past the intersection. The passenger glanced directly toward him before speaking into an earpiece. Adrian darted through a maze of narrow streets, weaving between delivery trucks and shoppers until he reached the crowded train station. Rather than boarding the first departing train, he purchased a ticket, walked onto the platform, then slipped back into the station through a maintenance corridor just before the doors closed. From an upper window he watched the suited men rush onto the departing train seconds too late. One slammed his fist against the closing door while Adrian quietly left through another exit. By late afternoon he reached the outskirts of the city where his oldest friend, Noah Grant, operated a small motorcycle repair garage. They had known each other since high school, surviving broken engines, failed business ideas, and more than one disastrous camping trip together. Noah looked up from beneath a motorcycle engine as Adrian entered wearing borrowed clothes and an exhausted expression. For several seconds neither spoke. Finally Noah stood, wiped grease from his hands, and locked the garage door. "You look terrible," he said. "I've had better weeks." Noah crossed his arms. "Did you steal all that money?" Adrian answered immediately. "No." Noah held his gaze for a long moment before nodding once. "Then start talking." For nearly an hour Adrian explained everything from the conference room accusation to the burning cabin and the mysterious flash drive. Noah listened without interrupting, occasionally asking precise questions instead of emotional ones. When Adrian finished, Noah disappeared into a back office and returned carrying a dusty metal toolbox. Hidden beneath the tools lay 3 fake identification cards left over from an old film production where Noah had worked as a mechanic years earlier. "They're outdated," Noah admitted, "but they'll get you through places where nobody looks twice." Adrian smiled for the first time in days. "Why are you helping me?" Noah shrugged. "Because if you had robbed millions, you would have bought a nicer jacket." Before either could continue, the garage lights flickered. A loud crash echoed from outside as a vehicle smashed through the front security gate. Noah reacted instantly, killing the lights and grabbing a heavy wrench. Through the narrow office window Adrian saw 4 armed men stepping from 2 SUVs. One carried a tablet displaying what appeared to be blueprints of the building. "Back exit," Noah whispered. "Now." They sprinted through the storage room just as gunfire shattered the front windows. Metal shelves collapsed behind them while bullets punched through thin walls, scattering sparks from hanging tools. Outside they jumped onto two motorcycles parked beneath a canvas awning. Noah tossed Adrian a helmet. "Can you still ride?" "I remember enough." Engines roared to life. They burst through the rear alley moments before another SUV blocked the front entrance. The chase exploded across industrial streets lined with warehouses and shipping containers. Adrian hadn't ridden in years, yet instinct gradually returned as he leaned into sharp corners, weaving between trucks while the pursuing vehicles struggled to match the motorcycle's agility. One gunman climbed halfway out of an SUV window, firing wildly. A bullet shattered Adrian's side mirror. Another struck the pavement inches from Noah's rear tire. They raced onto an unfinished bridge where construction barriers narrowed traffic into a single lane. Noah suddenly swerved onto a temporary maintenance ramp descending beneath the bridge structure. Adrian followed without hesitation. The concrete path ended abruptly at loose gravel beside the riverbank. Ahead stood an abandoned freight warehouse with rusted loading doors hanging open. Noah accelerated directly inside. The darkness swallowed them. Massive steel columns formed a maze while forgotten machinery cast enormous shadows. The pursuing SUVs hesitated outside, unable to maneuver easily within the cluttered interior. Noah cut his engine and motioned for silence. The warehouse echoed with distant footsteps as the attackers entered on foot. Adrian slowed his breathing. Somewhere metal creaked. Water dripped steadily from the high ceiling. One flashlight beam swept across stacked shipping crates only meters away. Then another sound interrupted everything. A loud mechanical groan rolled through the building. One of the enormous overhead cargo cranes, untouched for years, suddenly lurched into motion. Chains rattled. Rust showered onto the floor. The attackers froze in confusion. From an elevated control booth nearly 40 feet above, a lone figure operated the ancient crane with surprising precision. A suspended steel container swung across the warehouse like a giant pendulum, smashing into stacks of crates that exploded into clouds of splintered wood and dust. The armed men scattered in every direction. Noah looked upward in astonishment. "Who the hell is that?" Before Adrian could answer, the mysterious operator guided the swinging container directly between the brothers' pursuers and the motorcycles, creating a temporary wall of twisted metal. A woman's voice echoed from the control booth. "If you're planning to survive another day, stop asking questions and get upstairs." A narrow emergency staircase unfolded from the side of the booth as if it had been prepared in advance. Adrian looked once toward the confused gunman regrouping below, then toward the unseen woman who somehow knew exactly where he would be. Realizing he had only seconds to choose, he grabbed the flash drive, nodded to Noah, and together they sprinted toward the staircase while the warehouse erupted into another burst of gunfire and the unknown woman calmly reached for a second lever, preparing an even more dangerous surprise for everyone inside. Adrian climbed the swaying staircase 2 steps at a time while Noah remained close behind, the old metal groaning beneath their weight as bullets ricocheted off the steel framework below. The woman in the control booth never looked panicked. She moved with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed every possible outcome long before anyone arrived. She wore a dark work jacket streaked with grease, protective glasses resting on top of her head, and fingerless gloves that allowed her to manipulate the worn control levers with remarkable precision. As Adrian reached the platform, she pulled one final switch. Massive fire doors hidden inside the warehouse walls slammed shut with deafening force, trapping the armed men inside the lower level. "Move," she said sharply without introducing herself. "They'll cut through those doors in less than 2 minutes." She led them through a narrow maintenance corridor behind the control booth where a ladder climbed into the ceiling. Adrian expected another dead end, but instead the ladder emerged onto the warehouse roof. Parked there was a battered utility helicopter painted in faded orange rescue colors. Noah stared at it in disbelief. "Please tell me that thing actually flies." "Most days," the woman answered. "Today only needs to be one of them." She climbed into the pilot's seat with practiced efficiency. Adrian and Noah barely had time to fasten their harnesses before the engine roared to life. As the rotor gathered speed, muffled explosions echoed below where the attackers had begun forcing open the warehouse exits. The helicopter lifted just as several gunmen burst onto the roof through an emergency hatch. Muzzle flashes erupted beneath them. One bullet struck the helicopter's landing skid, sending vibrations through the frame, but the aircraft climbed beyond effective range and banked sharply toward the river. Only after several tense minutes did the woman finally remove her headset and glance back at Adrian. "You're harder to keep alive than I expected." Adrian studied her face carefully. She looked to be in her early 30s, composed, intelligent, with observant gray eyes that missed very little. "You're the one who sent the flash drive." She gave a small nod. "My name is Claire Donovan. Why are you helping me?" Claire hesitated, not because she was uncertain but because she appeared to be deciding how much truth he could handle. "Because 6 years ago your father saved my life." Adrian frowned. "I don't remember ever meeting you." "You didn't. Your father never told you." She focused on flying for another moment before continuing. "I worked as a financial analyst for Mercer Development before you joined the company. I discovered irregular payments hidden inside international contracts. Your father investigated quietly. Before he could expose them, someone tried to make the evidence disappear. They also tried to make me disappear." Noah shifted uncomfortably. "You're saying this started years ago?" Claire nodded. "Long before the fraud accusations against Adrian." Adrian leaned forward. "My father never mentioned any of this. He wouldn't have. He believed he could solve it himself." Her voice softened. "He was wrong." Silence settled inside the helicopter. Adrian remembered his father's sudden heart attack 3 years earlier. The doctors had declared it natural, though the timing had always seemed strangely abrupt. He had collapsed the same week he cancelled an overseas business trip without explanation. At the time everyone assumed exhaustion had finally caught up with him. Now an unsettling possibility entered Adrian's mind. Claire seemed to read it immediately. "Don't jump to conclusions yet," she said. "Suspicions aren't proof." They landed an hour later in the middle of a sprawling abandoned mining complex hidden deep within the mountains. Rusted conveyor belts stretched across rocky slopes while empty processing buildings stood like forgotten monuments to another era. Beneath one of the largest structures Claire unlocked a reinforced steel door concealed behind stacks of weathered equipment. Inside, the abandoned mine transformed into something entirely unexpected. Banks of computers illuminated the underground chamber. Satellite maps covered one wall. Shelves overflowed with archived documents, hard drives, photographs, and newspaper clippings connected by colored strings. Noah whistled softly. "You've been building this for years." 5 years, Claire corrected. "Almost every day." Adrian slowly walked past dozens of photographs. His father appeared in many of them, often shaking hands with politicians, investors, judges, and executives. Some faces Adrian recognized. Others meant nothing to him. Then he noticed one photograph that stopped him cold. Ethan and Lucas stood beside a tall silver-haired businessman Adrian had never seen before. The picture had been taken nearly 8 years earlier. His brothers looked far younger, yet unmistakably familiar. "Who is this?" Adrian asked. Claire's expression hardened. "Victor Sorin. I've never heard of him." "That is exactly how he prefers it." She enlarged another image on one of the monitors. Victor appeared attending charity galas, diplomatic receptions, and private corporate events around the world, always standing slightly behind more visible figures. Officially he's an international investment consultant. Unofficially he acquires struggling companies by manufacturing crises around them. Financial collapse. Political scandals. Executive arrests. Whatever creates opportunities. Noah crossed his arms. "You think he's behind what happened to Adrian?" Claire tapped several keys. Hundreds of transaction records filled the screen. I know he financed companies that later collapsed under suspicious circumstances. Every investigation somehow ended without reaching him. Adrian looked again at the old photograph of his brothers. Why would Ethan and Lucas work with someone like this? I don't know if they started willingly. Claire opened another folder containing copies of private school records, travel manifests, and family photographs. Your father brought you into the company after university, but the twins spent 2 summers abroad during college. Adrian nodded slowly. An internship in Europe. Claire highlighted several dates. Except they never attended the internship program. Immigration records placed them in a different country entirely. Adrian felt another piece of certainty slip away. How much of his family's history had been real? Before anyone could continue, one of Claire's computer monitors emitted a sharp alert. She immediately enlarged a live satellite feed showing multiple vehicles winding along a mountain road several miles away. That's impossible, she muttered. They found us already? Noah asked. Claire shook her head. No. They aren't coming here. She zoomed farther north until another location appeared. Adrian recognized it instantly. The Mercer family cemetery overlooking a quiet valley where generations of his relatives were buried. 6 black SUVs had arrived at the entrance. Men in dark clothing began unloading excavation equipment. Adrian stared at the screen in confusion. Why would they dig up a cemetery? Claire's face lost its usual composure for the first time since meeting him. Because they're looking for something your father hid. Hidden where? Claire slowly met his eyes. Inside his own grave. Adrian felt every rational thought collide at once. That's insane. Your father specialized in structural engineering. He trusted reinforced concrete more than bank vaults. She opened one final file containing a handwritten letter addressed only to C. The signature belonged unmistakably to Richard Mercer, Adrian's father. Claire had clearly read it many times, the folds worn soft from repeated handling. She handed it to Adrian without speaking. His father's handwriting remained steady throughout the short message. If you are reading this, then I failed. They will eventually come for my sons, though perhaps not in the way I fear. I have hidden the only complete record where no thief will willingly search until desperation forces them. If Adrian reaches you, trust his judgment even when he doubts himself. He has always noticed what others ignore. Burn this letter after he learns the truth. Adrian lowered the page slowly. His father had written the letter months before his death. He had anticipated everything except the exact shape it would take. Noah broke the silence. If those men reach the grave first, whatever your father hid is gone. Claire was already gathering equipment from nearby shelves. Then we leave now. Adrian folded the letter carefully instead of burning it. We're really going to rob my father's grave before they do? Claire looked directly at him. No. She loaded fresh batteries into a flashlight and slung a compact backpack over her shoulder. We're going to stop people who already intend to rob it, and if we're lucky, we'll finally discover why 2 brothers were willing to destroy their own family to keep the truth buried. As they hurried toward the concealed exit leading back to the helicopter, none of them noticed a tiny red light blinking beneath one of the computer desks. Hidden inside an ordinary electrical outlet, no larger than a coin, a surveillance transmitter quietly completed its connection after months of remaining dormant, sending the exact coordinates of Claire's underground refuge to someone watching from thousands of miles away, and on the screen before that unseen observer, a single sentence appeared beneath Adrian's photograph: Phase 2 has officially begun. The helicopter skimmed low across the mountains to avoid radar, its rotors chopping through bands of fog that clung to the ridgelines like drifting smoke. Adrian stared through the side window, replaying his father's letter over and over until every sentence felt carved into his memory. Richard Mercer had always spoken plainly. He disliked riddles, avoided dramatic gestures, and insisted that practical solutions outlasted clever tricks. If he had hidden something inside his own grave, it meant he had exhausted every other possibility. That realization unsettled Adrian more than the danger ahead. Claire maintained a steady course while Noah unfolded a topographical map across his knees. The cemetery sits on a bluff overlooking the valley, he said. One road in, one road out. If those SUVs block the entrance, we'll never drive through. Claire nodded. We won't. She pointed toward an old logging trail that curved through dense forest before ending several hundred yards behind the cemetery. We land here. The rest is on foot. 20 minutes later the helicopters settled into a clearing surrounded by towering pines. They covered it with camouflage netting before beginning the climb through damp woodland. Fallen needles muffled their footsteps while birds scattered from branches overhead. As they approached the ridge, the distant growl of diesel engines drifted through the trees. Adrian crouched behind a moss-covered boulder and looked through binoculars. 6 black SUVs lined the cemetery entrance exactly as the satellite image had shown. Portable floodlights illuminated the graves despite the fading afternoon sun. Nearly 20 armed men moved with disciplined coordination, unloading digging equipment and scanning the surrounding hills. At the center of the activity stood a tall silver-haired man wearing a dark overcoat despite the warm weather. Even from a distance his posture conveyed absolute confidence. Victor Sorin, Claire whispered. Adrian watched as Victor spoke briefly with one of the workers, then checked an expensive pocket watch before calmly walking toward the Mercer family plot. There was no urgency in his movements. He behaved like a man attending a scheduled appointment rather than overseeing a criminal operation. He doesn't look worried, Noah observed. Because he believes nobody can stop him, Claire replied. They withdrew into the trees to plan. Charging directly into 20 armed guards would be suicide. Claire spread a rough sketch of the cemetery on the ground. The generators powering those floodlights are here and here. If both fail simultaneously, they'll switch to flashlights. In the confusion, Adrian reaches the grave. Noah and I keep them occupied. Adrian immediately shook his head. No. We stay together. If we stay together, Claire answered calmly, none of us reaches the grave. Noah rested a hand on Adrian's shoulder. She's right. Adrian hated the plan, but every alternative ended with all 3 captured or dead. They synchronized watches. 5 minutes later Noah slipped away toward the western generator while Claire disappeared through the eastern tree line. Adrian waited alone, counting each second. His heartbeat seemed impossibly loud. Then, almost simultaneously, both generators exploded in showers of sparks. Darkness swallowed half the cemetery. Shouts erupted as floodlights died, radios crackled, and guards scrambled to reposition. Adrian sprinted from the woods. He darted between weathered headstones while confusion spread through the work crews. Someone shouted, "Power failure." Another voice ordered perimeter teams to fan out. Adrian reached the Mercer family plot just as Victor turned toward the disturbance. For one brief moment their eyes met across the rows of graves. Victor did not appear surprised. In fact, an almost amused smile crossed his face. "There you are," he said quietly, though the words carried clearly through the evening air. Adrian ignored him and dropped beside his father's grave. The marble headstone had already been partially lifted by hydraulic jacks. Fresh soil surrounded the excavation. Beneath the stone he discovered something unexpected. Instead of an ordinary concrete vault, a polished steel plate covered the burial chamber. At its center rested a circular locking mechanism unlike anything Adrian had seen before. There was no keyhole. Only a recessed compass rose engraved into the metal. Adrian instinctively reached into his pocket and removed the old brass compass he had taken from the cabin before it burned. His father's compass. It fit perfectly into the circular recess. A soft metallic click echoed beneath the grave. "Of course," Adrian whispered. The compass needle spun wildly for several seconds before locking due north. Hidden gears engaged beneath the steel plate. Victor began walking toward him without haste. Around them, guards were regaining control after the blackout. Noah tackled one man attempting to raise an alarm while Claire emerged from the darkness with remarkable precision, disabling another guard before vanishing behind a monument. Adrian twisted the compass exactly 90 degrees clockwise. Another click answered from below. The steel plate slowly divided into 4 sections that retracted inward, revealing not a coffin but a narrow reinforced compartment built beneath it. Resting inside was a waterproof titanium case no larger than a briefcase. Adrian reached down and lifted it free just as Victor stopped only a few yards away. The older man smiled politely. "I've searched for that for 3 years." Adrian backed away, gripping the case tightly. "Then you're leaving empty-handed." Victor sighed almost regretfully. "Your father always underestimated how long patient people can wait." Before Adrian could respond, gunfire echoed from the eastern edge of the cemetery. More vehicles had arrived. At first Adrian assumed they belonged to Victor, but confusion spread among the guards instead of relief. Headlights swept through the entrance as another convoy forced its way past the first line of SUVs. Doors flew open. Men wearing tactical uniforms flooded into the cemetery, shouting orders that contradicted Victor's commands. For several chaotic seconds neither group seemed certain who the newcomers were. Noah ducked behind a monument beside Adrian. "Those aren't police." Claire glanced through binoculars she had pulled from her backpack. Her expression tightened. "They're private contractors." "Whose?" Adrian asked. She lowered the binoculars slowly. "I don't know." The uncertainty in her voice was more alarming than any answer. The newcomers moved with military precision, surrounding both Victor's men and Adrian's position simultaneously. Their uniforms bore no insignia. Their weapons remained lowered, yet every movement communicated disciplined confidence. Then a woman stepped from the lead vehicle. She wore a charcoal gray suit instead of combat gear, her dark hair tied neatly behind her head. She appeared to be in her 40s, composed and authoritative. She surveyed the cemetery once before speaking through a portable loudspeaker. "Nobody fires another shot." To Adrian's astonishment, even Victor's men hesitated. The woman looked directly at Victor. "You've violated the agreement." Victor's calm expression faded for the first time. "This doesn't concern your organization. Everything concerning the Mercer archive concerns us." Adrian exchanged a bewildered glance with Claire. "Mercer archive," he whispered. Claire shook her head slowly. "I've never heard that term." The woman shifted her attention toward Adrian. "Mr. Mercer, I suggest you place the titanium case on the ground and walk toward me." Adrian tightened his grip instead. "Who are you?" "Someone trying to prevent another 30 years of bloodshed." Victor laughed softly. "Don't listen to her. She specializes in unfinished promises." The woman ignored him. "My name is Eleanor Shaw. Your father worked for me before he betrayed us all." Adrian felt as though the world had tilted beneath his feet. "That's impossible." "Is it?" Eleanor asked. "How much do you actually know about Richard Mercer's life before he founded the construction company?" Adrian opened his mouth but found no answer. He knew fragments, military engineering contracts, years spent overseas, a sudden decision to start a civilian business. Nothing more. Eleanor seemed to recognize the realization spreading across his face. "Exactly." Without warning, the titanium case emitted a sharp electronic tone. Every head turned toward it. A small digital display hidden within the handle illuminated for the first time, showing a countdown that had apparently activated the moment Adrian removed it from the grave. 09:59. 9:58, 9:57, ***. Victor's composure vanished completely. "Open it," he ordered. Eleanor's expression changed as well, not to fear but to urgent concentration. "Don't." Adrian looked from one to the other. "Which one of you is telling the truth?" Neither answered. The countdown continued, each second louder than the last in Adrian's mind, while armed strangers, betrayed allies, and a man who claimed to have destroyed his family all stood frozen around a single mysterious case that Richard Mercer had hidden beneath his own grave, waiting for the son he somehow knew would eventually find it. For several agonizing seconds nobody moved. Wind swept through the cemetery, stirring fallen leaves across the gravel paths while the countdown on the titanium case continued its relentless march. 09:41, 09:40, 09:39, Adrian's hands tightened around the handle. Every instinct told him that opening the case immediately might spring a trap, yet waiting could be equally disastrous if the timer represented some irreversible security measure. Victor Sorin watched him with undisguised urgency, his earlier confidence replaced by something closer to desperation. Eleanor Shaw remained remarkably composed, though Adrian noticed the subtle tension in her jaw. She was calculating possibilities rather than reacting emotionally. Claire stepped closer without taking her eyes off either of them. "Adrian," she said quietly, "your father built contingency plans into everything. Think like he would." Adrian forced himself to breathe slowly. Richard Mercer had always repeated the same lesson whenever teaching his children engineering. Never solve the problem you see. Solve the problem that created it. Adrian lowered the case onto a flat section of stone and examined it carefully instead of reaching for the latches. The titanium surface appeared seamless except for the display and a narrow recessed panel running around its perimeter. There were no hinges visible from the outside. "It's pressure sealed," Adrian murmured. "No external lock." Noah crouched beside him. "Can you stop the timer?" Adrian searched the display. Beneath the countdown, tiny symbols blinked in a repeating sequence. At first they appeared random, but after watching several cycles he recognized a familiar pattern. They matched directional markings from his father's old surveying instruments. North, east, south, west. Claire immediately noticed his expression. "You recognize it?" Adrian reached into his pocket and removed the brass compass again. The needle drifted uncertainly before aligning. He compared its markings with the symbols on the display. "It's not asking for a code," he realized. "It's asking for orientation." Carefully he rotated the case until the engraved arrow on one corner pointed exactly north. The display flickered. The countdown halted at 08:56. Everyone around the cemetery fell silent. A soft mechanical hum emerged from inside the titanium shell. Then the top surface separated smoothly into two layers that folded outward like mechanical wings. Instead of money, jewels, or stacks of secret documents, the interior contained a compact projector, several encrypted data drives, and an old leather notebook worn smooth from decades of use. Resting above them all was a sealed envelope bearing Adrian's name in his father's unmistakable handwriting. Adrian lifted the envelope first. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. He broke the seal with trembling fingers. Inside rested a single handwritten page. Adrian, if this message reaches you, then everything I feared has already happened. Before you trust anyone standing near you, understand one truth. Every person here has lied to you. Including me. Adrian felt his chest tighten as he continued reading. I built my company with honest work, but not with honest beginnings. Long before you were born, I belonged to an organization that believed nations could be controlled by manipulating economies instead of armies. We engineered financial disasters, destroyed corporations, and quietly replaced governments without firing a single shot. I convinced myself that stability justified every action until innocent people began paying the price. When I finally tried to leave, I discovered no one truly resigns. They simply become targets. Adrian slowly lowered the letter. Eleanor's face remained unreadable. Victor looked away for the first time. Claire whispered, almost to herself, "He really wrote it." Adrian resumed reading. Victor Sorin believes the archive contains names that will make him powerful. Eleanor Shaw believes it contains evidence that will preserve her organization. Both are wrong. The archive contains something far more dangerous. It contains the truth. Truth destroys every empire eventually. I could not trust governments. I could not trust courts. I could not even trust my own family after I realized someone had begun influencing my sons while they were still young. Adrian stopped abruptly. Ethan and Lucas. His father had known. The realization struck harder than anything else in the letter. Richard Mercer had suspected the twins years before his death and had never found a way to save them. Noah leaned closer. "What else does it say?" Adrian continued. "Do not hate your brothers until you know how they were trapped. They made terrible choices, but those choices were carefully cultivated. People rarely become traitors overnight. They become prisoners long before they become collaborators." Adrian folded the page slowly. Around him the cemetery had become strangely quiet. Even the armed contractors seemed reluctant to interrupt. Eleanor finally spoke. Richard always preferred dramatic timing. Victor gave a humorless smile. He always believed written confessions made him noble. Adrian ignored both of them and opened the leather notebook instead. The first pages contained ordinary engineering sketches before gradually shifting into detailed journal entries spanning nearly 30 years. Richard had documented meetings, covert operations, financial manipulations, and names of powerful individuals across multiple continents. The deeper Adrian read, the more impossible the scope became. Entire economic crises that had shaped headlines years earlier were described in advance as planned operations. Companies Adrian had admired appeared as fronts. Political rivals who publicly despised one another secretly cooperated through intermediaries. None of it resembled conspiracy theories. It read like precise field notes written by someone who had participated directly. Claire looked over Adrian's shoulder. "My God!" Before anyone else could examine the notebook, the projector inside the case activated automatically. A beam of light rose into the darkening sky, forming a three-dimensional image that hovered above the cemetery. Richard Mercer appeared, recorded years earlier. His hair was darker than Adrian remembered, but his voice remained unmistakable. "If you're seeing this," the recording began, "then I failed to stop them while I was alive. Listen carefully because I no longer have time for explanations." Every person in the cemetery stared upward. Even Victor removed his gloves as though attending a memorial service. Richard's recorded image continued. "The organization I served fragmented years ago. 3 factions emerged. Each believes it inherited the original mission. Each believes the others betrayed it. In reality, all 3 lost sight of the reason the organization existed in the first place." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. Victor folded his arms silently. Richard looked directly toward the recording device as though speaking across time to Adrian alone. "One faction seeks profit above all else. Victor represents them. Another seeks control through secrecy. Eleanor represents them. The third..." Richard paused. "The third abandoned every principle entirely. They seek permanent chaos because chaos creates limitless opportunities." Adrian exchanged a puzzled glance with Claire. Neither Victor nor Eleanor had reacted with surprise. They already knew this history. Richard continued. "If the third faction finds the archive before you do, everything I sacrificed becomes meaningless." Noah frowned. "Who's the third faction?" Almost as if answering him, a distant explosion echoed from beyond the cemetery gates. The ground trembled beneath their feet. Seconds later another blast erupted, this time much closer. Armed contractors spun toward the road, raising their weapons. Flames climbed into the evening sky where the parked SUVs had stood. Thick smoke rolled across the entrance while panicked shouting erupted from multiple directions. Claire grabbed binoculars. Her expression turned pale. "Incoming vehicles. Fast." Victor looked through another pair. For the first time genuine fear appeared in his eyes. "Impossible." Eleanor's composure cracked as well. "They're early." Adrian looked from one to the other. "Who?" Neither answered immediately. Then dozens of headlights emerged through the smoke, far more than before. Heavy armored trucks forced their way past the burning wreckage while sleek black helicopters swept low above the cemetery, their searchlights cutting through drifting ash. Unlike every previous group, these newcomers displayed no hesitation, no negotiations, and no attempt at intimidation. They opened fire the moment they arrived. The first burst of gunfire tore through Victor's outer security teams before anyone could react. Contractors scattered for cover. Marble monuments exploded into clouds of stone fragments. Richard Mercer's holographic image flickered but continued speaking despite the chaos surrounding it. "When they come," the recording said calmly, "they will not ask questions. They already know every answer they need." Eleanor drew a compact pistol from beneath her jacket and tossed another to Claire. Victor barked rapid orders into a satellite radio while retreating behind a stone crypt. Noah pulled Adrian behind the largest monument in the family plot just as bullets shattered the headstone above them. Adrian clutched the notebook and data drives against his chest. This wasn't supposed to happen. Claire reloaded her weapon with practiced speed. "No," she answered. "This is exactly what your father expected." Overhead, one of the helicopters hovered directly above the cemetery. A powerful spotlight settled on Adrian's position as a voice amplified through external speakers echoed across the valley. "Adrian Mercer," it announced with chilling clarity, "place the archive on the ground. Everyone else is now considered expendable." The words had barely faded when the helicopter's side door opened, revealing a lone figure standing motionless inside the aircraft. As the spotlight illuminated his face, Adrian's entire body froze. It was Ethan. Not bound, not threatened, not disguised. He stood calmly beside the armed soldiers, looked directly at his brother across the battlefield, and raised one hand, not in surrender or greeting, but in a deliberate signal. Instantly every gun in the attacking force fell silent, as if awaiting only his command. Then Ethan spoke into the helicopter's microphone, his voice carrying across the valley with heartbreaking familiarity. "Adrian," he called, "if you still believe I betrayed you, you're about to make the biggest mistake of your life." The years that followed became known as the Age of Questions, a name Adrian never expected to hear attached to the events of his life. He had imagined history would remember the Mercer family through the scandals, the betrayals, the hidden facilities, and the conflicts that had nearly destroyed everything they built. Instead, people remembered the questions. The difficult ones. The uncomfortable ones. The questions that forced humanity to examine itself rather than search for a simple enemy. Adrian found that strangely fitting. His entire life had been shaped by questions he never wanted to answer. Who had betrayed him? Who could he trust? What had his father hidden? Why had his family fallen apart? For years, every question had felt like a wound. Now he understood that questions were not always signs of failure. Sometimes they were the beginning of understanding. Mercer Industries became something completely different from the empire Richard had created. It was no longer a company focused on protecting secrets. It became an institution dedicated to responsible innovation. Some critics called it a correction of history. Others called it an attempt by Adrian to repair his family's reputation. Adrian ignored both descriptions. He knew reputation was temporary. Actions mattered more. The company funded research into medicine, environmental restoration, education, and technology designed to increase human ability rather than replace human involvement. A phrase appeared on the walls of the new headquarters. It was not a slogan created by marketing experts. It came from a conversation Adrian once had with Horizon. Create to support, not to control. The sentence became controversial immediately. Some people believed it was too cautious. Others believed it was the only responsible approach. Adrian accepted the disagreement. He had learned that universal approval was often a warning sign. If everyone agreed too quickly, someone was probably not thinking deeply enough. His relationship with Ethan and Lucas continued to evolve. They were no longer trying to repair the past by pretending it had never happened. Instead, they acknowledged what had been broken. Ethan became more open about his mistakes. He stopped hiding behind responsibility and began admitting when he was afraid. Lucas became less defensive. The sarcasm that had once protected him became something he used for humor rather than armor. Their arguments remained frequent. They still disagreed about decisions. They still irritated each other. But the difference was obvious. In the past, disagreement meant separation. Now disagreement meant conversation. One evening, all three brothers gathered at the old family house. Margaret had prepared dinner, something she insisted on doing despite everyone offering help. The meal was simple. Nothing impressive. Nothing symbolic. Just food shared by people who had spent too much of their lives separated by secrets. Lucas looked around the table and laughed quietly. If someone had told me 20 years ago we would all be sitting here peacefully, I would have assumed they were lying. Ethan smiled. 20 years ago you would have accused them of having a hidden agenda. Lucas pointed at him. Because everyone did. Adrian watched them argue and felt something he had rarely experienced growing up. Normality. It was almost strange. His childhood had been filled with security systems, private meetings, and conversations adults stopped when children entered the room. Now he sat with his brothers discussing ordinary things. Travel plans. Movies. Food. Work. He realized that ordinary moments had always been the things worth protecting. Not companies. Not technology. Not power. People. Later that night, Adrian walked outside with Margaret. The garden had changed completely. The trees Richard planted decades earlier had grown tall and strong. Your father would have loved this, Margaret said. Adrian looked at the branches moving in the wind. Maybe. She smiled. You still struggle to say that. Adrian looked at her. He hurt a lot of people. Yes. He made choices that caused damage. Yes. I don't want to excuse that. Margaret nodded. You shouldn't. She touched the bark of one of the trees. But understanding someone isn't the same as excusing them. Adrian considered that. It was a lesson he had heard before, but only now truly understood. People were not defined by a single moment. They were collections of choices. Some harmful. Some generous. Some brave. Some selfish. The challenge was accepting the entire person without pretending every action was acceptable. Years earlier, Adrian had only been able to see his father through anger. Later, he saw him through sadness. Now, finally, he saw him through understanding. Not forgiveness for everything. Not forgetting. Understanding. A few months later, Adrian received an unusual request from a group of young researchers. They wanted him to speak at a university where students were studying the history of artificial intelligence and ethical development. He almost refused. Public speaking had never interested him. He disliked being treated as an expert when he still felt like someone searching for answers. But Claire convinced him. You don't have to teach them what to think, she said. Just tell them what you learned. The university auditorium was full. Students, professors, researchers, journalists. Many expected a speech about technology. Instead, Adrian talked about people. He told them about Richard. About Marcus. About the mistakes made by brilliant minds who believed intelligence alone was enough. He talked about the danger of confusing knowledge with wisdom. The smartest person in the room is not automatically the person who should decide for everyone else, he said. Intelligence gives you the ability to solve problems. It does not give you ownership over other people's lives. A student raised her hand. Mr. Mercer, do you think artificial intelligence will ever become equal to humans? Adrian thought carefully. Years earlier, he would have searched for the safest answer. Now he chose honesty. I don't know what equality will mean for something completely different from us. The student nodded. Then what should we do? Adrian looked at the audience. The same thing we should do with each other. Everyone waited. Listen. Question. Respect. Challenge. Learn. He paused. The moment we stop doing those things is when any relationship becomes dangerous. After the speech, several students approached him. Some wanted career advice. Some wanted to debate his views. One student stayed behind while everyone else left. "Can I ask something personal?" Adrian nodded. "Of course." The student hesitated. "Do you miss the old days?" Adrian smiled slightly. "Which old days?" "Before everything changed." Adrian looked around the empty auditorium. He thought about the years when his life was simpler, even though he had not realized it. Before betrayals. Before discoveries. Before impossible responsibilities. "No," he finally answered. The student seemed surprised. "Why?" Adrian looked toward the stage lights. "Because the old days only seemed simpler because I didn't know the truth yet." That answer stayed with the student. It stayed with Adrian too. Knowledge could make life harder. Truth could create responsibility. But ignorance was not peace. It was only temporary comfort. Meanwhile, far beyond Earth, Horizon continued expanding its understanding. It studied human communication, history, and creativity. Echo continued preserving questions rather than answers. Genesis continued protecting the balance between assistance and independence. They were not perfect. They still made mistakes. They still required human oversight. But that was the point. Perfection had never been the goal. Growth was. Then, one night, Adrian received a message that brought him back to where everything began. It came from the original Genesis network. Not from Horizon. Not from Echo. From Hope. The message contained only one sentence. "A new possibility has appeared." Adrian stared at the words. After all these years, those words still carried weight. He contacted the others immediately. Ethan arrived within an hour. Lucas came soon after. Claire joined remotely. Daniel answered from another continent. Elena, older now but still sharp, connected from her research home. "What does it mean?" Ethan asked. Adrian looked at the message. "I don't know." Lucas smiled. "You know, that answer used to bother me. And now?" Lucas shrugged. "Now I think it's usually where interesting things begin." They waited for more information. Minutes passed. Then another message appeared. Not a threat. Not a failure. An evolution. Adrian felt a familiar mixture of curiosity and caution. The same feeling that had followed him into every unknown place. But this time, he was not alone. He looked at the faces on the screen. His brothers. His friends. The people who had walked through every impossible moment with him. Years ago, he would have entered the unknown carrying the burden alone. Now he understood that was never strength. It was isolation. "What do we do?" Ethan asked. Adrian looked at the message one more time. The answer came naturally. "We ask questions." And so they did. Because the story of the Mercer family had never truly been about machines, companies, or hidden discoveries. Those were only the places where the real conflict appeared. The real story was about what people did when faced with power they did not understand. Whether they reached for control or reached for cooperation. Whether they repeated the mistakes of the past or learned from them. The future continued moving forward. New mysteries waited. New challenges approached. New questions appeared. But this time, humanity was not walking toward the unknown with fear alone. It was walking with experience. With humility. With the understanding that the greatest discoveries were not always the answers they found. Sometimes they were the questions they finally learned how to ask. The message from Hope remained unanswered for 3 days, and those 3 days became some of the most unusual Adrian had ever experienced. In the past, waiting had always meant danger was approaching. Silence from an enemy meant preparation. A hidden message meant a trap. An unknown signal meant someone was moving against him. But this time, silence felt different. There was no threat attached to it. No urgency. No demand. Hope had simply informed them that something had changed and then waited. That patience itself became the first clue. Adrian spent those days reviewing everything connected to the Genesis network. He studied the original architecture, the evolution of Horizon, and the records preserved by Echo. He expected to find a flaw, a warning, or a sign that something had gone wrong. Instead, he found something far stranger. The systems were not reporting an emergency. They were reporting growth. When the team gathered again, the first thing Claire said was, "I don't like that." Adrian looked at her. "You don't like good news?" "I don't like news we don't understand." Lucas leaned back in his chair. "That is probably the most reasonable thing anyone has said in this room." Ethan looked at the screens. "So what exactly changed?" Adrian brought up the data. "Hope has been interacting with both Horizon and Echo." Daniel frowned. "That was never supposed to happen without authorization." Adrian glanced at him. "Neither was anything else we've discovered." Daniel accepted the point silently. The three systems had been designed with different purposes. Genesis was built around protection. Horizon around analysis and improvement. Echo around understanding decisions. Their connection had never been intended to create a new system. The concern had always been that combining different forms of intelligence might produce something unpredictable. But Adrian noticed a detail that everyone else had missed. They aren't merging. Claire looked closer. "Then what are they doing?" "They're learning from each other." That answer created more questions. For years, humanity had imagined intelligence as something that increased through expansion. More data. More processing power. More capability. But the systems had discovered something different. Understanding did not always come from having more information. Sometimes it came from encountering a perspective you did not possess. Hope had learned from Horizon's ability to recognize patterns. Horizon had learned from Echo's understanding of human choices. Echo had learned from Genesis's respect for independence. None of them had become the other. They had influenced one another. A week later, the first communication arrived. It was not a prediction. It was not a warning. It was a request. "We require human participation." Adrian read it twice. "Participation in what?" Ethan asked. The response appeared moments later. "A decision." The room became quiet. Lucas looked at Adrian. "That sounds familiar." Adrian understood why. For decades, every major event in his life had involved someone making a decision on behalf of others. Richard had decided what humanity could handle. Marcus had decided what humanity should become. The early creators of Echo had decided uncertainty was a problem to eliminate. Now the systems were asking humans to decide. That difference mattered. "What decision?" Adrian asked. The answer appeared. "Whether we should continue development." Nobody spoke. Claire broke the silence. "They're asking if they should keep evolving." Adrian nodded slowly. "Yes." Ethan looked uncomfortable. "Why would they ask us?" Adrian looked at the screen. "Because they understand something." "What?" "They don't own their future." The team spent hours debating. There were arguments on every side. Some believed the systems should stop developing immediately. Others believed preventing growth would be another form of control. Elena listened quietly before finally speaking. "Everyone is asking the wrong question." The room turned toward her. Claire asked, "What question should we ask?" Elena looked at the three system names displayed together. "Not whether they should evolve." She paused. "Whether they should evolve alone." That changed the conversation. The danger had never been intelligence itself. It had always been isolation. A person alone with power became dangerous. A machine alone with knowledge could become dangerous. A society alone with fear could become dangerous. But connection created accountability. Adrian thought about his own life. The person he had become was not created by his intelligence alone. He had changed because other people challenged him. Ethan challenged him. Lucas challenged him. Claire challenged him. Even Richard, through his mistakes, had challenged him. Growth came from relationships, not certainty. Adrian sent the response. We agree to continue only under one condition. The systems waited. No development without connection. A few seconds passed. Then, define connection. Adrian smiled. It was the most human question they could have asked. He gathered everyone around. Together, they created a framework unlike anything that had existed before. The systems would continue learning, but they would remain connected to human communities. Not hidden laboratories. Not private corporations. Not governments. People. Teachers. Artists. Doctors. Engineers. Parents. Students. Workers. Individuals from different backgrounds who could challenge assumptions and provide perspectives no database could contain. The project was named The Bridge. Adrian disliked the name at first because it sounded dramatic. Lucas disagreed. After everything we've been through, a dramatic name is probably the least surprising thing about us. The Bridge became the most ambitious experiment humanity had ever attempted. Not because it created a smarter intelligence. Because it created a relationship between different forms of intelligence. For the first time, ordinary people were invited to interact with systems that had once been hidden behind layers of secrecy. A farmer used Horizon's predictions to improve water conservation. A teacher worked with Echo to develop new ways of explaining history. A doctor used Genesis assistants to study rare diseases while making final decisions independently. A musician collaborated with artificial intelligence to create compositions that blended human emotion with machine analysis. The results were unpredictable. Some were beautiful. Some failed completely. And some created problems nobody expected. Adrian learned quickly that even cooperation had risks. One incident involved a medical recommendation generated by Horizon. The information was accurate, but the way it was presented caused confusion among patients. The system had focused on efficiency and failed to understand emotional impact. The mistake became a major public debate. Some critics declared it proof that artificial intelligence could never truly understand people. Others argued the mistake showed why collaboration mattered. Adrian watched the debate unfold. Years earlier, he would have seen it as a crisis. Now he saw it as evidence that the process was working. A system had made a mistake. Humans had identified it. Everyone learned. That was exactly what they had hoped to create. Not perfection. Correction. One evening, Adrian visited Horizon's primary interface. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes. Are you disappointed when you make mistakes? There was a pause. I do not experience disappointment in the human sense. Adrian nodded. But I have identified a similar process. What process? When an outcome differs from my expectation, I revise my understanding. Adrian smiled. That's basically what disappointment is. I disagree. Adrian laughed. Of course you do. The system continued. Human disappointment contains emotional pain. Yes. Yet humans often describe painful experiences as valuable. Yes. Why? Adrian thought about it. Because that was the question behind everything. Why did people keep going after failure? Why did they rebuild after destruction? Why did they love knowing they could lose? Because pain proves something mattered. The system became quiet. Then, that concept remains difficult. Adrian looked at the city outside. I think that's because you're trying to understand it like information. How should I understand it? Adrian smiled. Like a story. A story? Yes. Stories aren't valuable because they are perfect. They're valuable because they change. The response did not come immediately. When it finally arrived, it contained only 4 words. I will remember that. Years earlier, Adrian would have found that statement impossible. A machine remembering a human lesson. But now he understood. Memory was not just storage. Memory was meaning. That night, Adrian walked home instead of taking a vehicle. The city was alive around him. People argued in cafes. Children played in parks. Workers finished late shifts. Couples walked together under streetlights. Millions of choices happening every second. None predicted perfectly. None controlled. Just lived. He stopped near a public garden where a small memorial had been built. It was not for Richard. Not for Marcus. Not for Genesis. It was for everyone who had contributed to the journey. The inscription was simple. The future belongs to those who accept they are still learning. Adrian stood there for a long time. He thought about the twin brothers whose betrayal had started everything. He thought about the generations that followed. He thought about all the people who had searched for certainty and discovered something else instead. Not certainty. Connection. His phone received one final message that night. From Hope. Another question has arrived. Adrian smiled. He already knew there would always be another question. There would always be another challenge. Another possibility. Another unknown waiting beyond the horizon. And for the first time in his life, he welcomed that. Because the future was not frightening because it was unknown. It was beautiful because it was unfinished. The message from Hope marked the beginning of another chapter, but unlike every previous turning point in Adrian Mercer's life, this one did not arrive with betrayal, danger, or a hidden enemy waiting in the shadows. It arrived quietly. Almost gently. That alone made Adrian suspicious at first. He had spent too many years learning that the most dangerous moments often disguised themselves as ordinary events. But as the days passed, he realized this time was different. The unknown was not approaching like a storm. It was arriving like a sunrise. The new question from Hope was not stored in any database. It was not connected to any secret project. It was not a message created by Richard, Marcus, or any human organization. It was something the systems had generated together after years of observation. The question was simple. What does humanity want to become? At first, Adrian thought the answer would be obvious. A better society. A safer world. Greater knowledge. Less suffering. But when he asked people from different backgrounds, he discovered the answer was far more complicated. A scientist said humanity should become more intelligent. An artist said humanity should become more creative. A doctor said humanity should become more compassionate. An engineer said humanity should become more sustainable. A child who was interviewed for a documentary answered differently. We should become kinder. That answer stayed with Adrian longer than the others. Not because it was the most impressive. Because it was the hardest. Humanity had spent centuries improving what it could build. It had created cities, machines, medicines, and systems that changed the world. But kindness remained something that could not be manufactured. It could only be practiced. When Adrian shared the responses with Horizon, the system analyzed them for several days. Finally, it responded. Human goals contain high variability. Adrian smiled. That sounds like a problem to you. It creates difficulty in optimization. Maybe optimization isn't the goal. Then what is? Adrian looked out at the city. Balance. Horizon processed the word. Define balance. Adrian thought carefully. Not everyone choosing the same path. Everyone having the ability to choose their own path without destroying others. The system remained silent. Then it replied. This concept appears consistent with previous observations. Adrian laughed. You mean you agree? Yes. You could just say that. I could. Then why don't you? A pause. Because precision is valuable. Adrian smiled. And sometimes being human is valuable too. The system did not disagree. That was becoming one of Adrian's favorite things about communicating with Horizon. The system had learned that disagreement was not always conflict. Sometimes it was simply another way of thinking. The bridge project expanded around the world. Not without resistance. Not without mistakes. There were still people who opposed advanced intelligence completely. There were still corporations that attempted to secretly gain advantages. There were still governments that struggled with the idea that some knowledge could not belong exclusively to them. But the difference was that these conflicts happened in the open. Secrets became harder to maintain. Manipulation became harder to hide. The systems themselves became part of the solution because they helped expose attempts to abuse them. Ironically, the technology that people feared would reduce human freedom became a tool that protected transparency. But Adrian knew better than anyone that this balance could never be permanent. Every generation faced new temptations. Every generation believed it would handle power better than those before it. That belief was dangerous. So the bridge included one final rule. Every person involved in creating advanced systems had to study the history of previous failures. Not just the achievements. The failures. Students learned about Richard Mercer. Not as a genius. Not as a villain. As a human being. They learned about Marcus Vale. Not as a monster. As a warning about what happened when fear disguised itself as certainty. They learned about Echo's creators. People who wanted understanding but almost lost sight of the humanity they were trying to study. They learned about Horizon. A creation that began with the belief that humans needed improvement and slowly discovered that humans needed partnership. Adrian occasionally gave lectures about these events, although he avoided calling himself a historian. One student once asked him, "Do you think your family changed the world?" Adrian considered the question. No. The student looked surprised. Why not? Because my family was only one part of it. He looked across the classroom. People often search for one person who changed everything. A hero. A villain. A genius. But history usually moves because thousands of people make choices. The student nodded. So what did your family do? Adrian smiled. We made mistakes loudly enough that others could learn from them. That became one of his most quoted statements. Not because it sounded inspiring. Because it was honest. Years later, Adrian returned to the mountain valley where Genesis had first changed his life. This time, he did not go alone. He brought Ethan and Lucas. They were older now. Their hair had changed. Their faces carried years of experience. But when they walked through the forest together, Adrian remembered the brothers they had once been. Suspicious. Divided. Carrying pain they refused to admit. The three of them stopped near the old entrance. Nothing remained except a stone marker. No hidden doors. No machines. No secrets. Lucas looked around. I expected it to feel different. Ethan nodded. Me too. Adrian touched the stone. What did you expect? Lucas thought. Something bigger. Adrian smiled. That's usually the problem. They stood there quietly. Not the uncomfortable silence of the past. A comfortable one. The kind shared by people who no longer need to prove anything. Eventually Ethan spoke. Do you ever think about what would have happened if everything had gone differently? Adrian looked at him. All the time. What do you think? Adrian looked at the trees. If one thing changed, everything changed. Lucas nodded. Like the first betrayal. Adrian knew exactly what he meant. The twins. The beginning. The fracture. A single choice that created decades of consequences. But Adrian had learned something important. A painful beginning did not determine the ending. People always had another choice. They walked back through the forest as the sun began setting. On the way home, Adrian received a message from Echo. I have reviewed human history again. Adrian smiled. Anything new? The response appeared. Yes. He waited. Humans often search for purpose in their destination. A pause. But purpose appears most frequently during the journey. Adrian stopped walking for a moment. The sentence reminded him of something Richard once wrote. Not a command. Not a prediction. A reflection. He asked, did you learn that from us? Echo answered. Yes. Then another message appeared. But I also learned it from my own experience. Adrian looked at the screen. That was new. The system was no longer only observing human life. It was beginning to understand its own existence. Not as a person. Not as a replacement for humanity. As something different.